Everybody, and welcome to the first meeting of 2015 for the Portland Children's Levy Allocation Committee. I'm Commissioner Dan Saltzman, also the chair of the Allocation Committee, and on my left is Serena Stoudemire Wesley. And on my immediate right is Julie Young, and on my far right is Mitch Horniker. Mitch represents Portland Business Alliance, Julie represents the citizens of Portland, Serena represents Multnomah County citizens. County Chair Deborah Kafori is unable to join us today, but her staff is present in the audience. And as we always start at the beginning of our meeting, we offer the opportunity for anybody to make comments to us on any topic that's not on the agenda. Do I see anybody that wishes to speak to us? No. Okay. So we have concluded our 3-year funding round, and staff has been busy looking at what we've, at where we've been and how the programs we've invested in have performed, as well as all of the associated systems and processes that go along with that to help the levy forge a strong path into the future in terms of strategies and goals. And to that end, they've prepared several very comprehensive and impressive reports that they will lead us through today. And we'll also discuss some positive financial forecasts, which I've spoken to each one of you on the phone about. We'll spend some time talking about feedback from the most recent funding process and how that might impact improve future funding rounds. And so with that, I will turn it over. I forgot to introduce all of our staff here. Lisa Pellegrino, Staff Director, Meg McElroy, Assistant Director, and Lisa Hansel, who's in charge of Child Abuse Prevention, Intervention, and Foster Care Investments. Mary Gay Broderick, our Communications Director, and John Kelly, our Fiscal Specialist. So I'll turn it over to Lisa Pellegrino. Oh, do we have minutes? Okay. Okay. So we have to approve minutes from our last meeting, whenever that was. September.
Sorry, I just put it on the agenda, but I forgot about it momentarily until Meg pointed it out to me.
Okay.
We have to do that.
Well, do we have a motion to approve the minutes from our September meeting?
So moved.
Okay.
One at a time.
Yeah, one at a time. That's the key.
Second.
Second. Okay.
Put mine on. Okay, there we go. All right, we have to take turns like preschoolers. So I wanted to go over a little bit the revenue forecast, just so we announce it in a public meeting. We're not really going to get into what to do about it quite today because we wanted to take this opportunity to have a discussion about kind of where we've been and what that might teach us for the future as because staff has been engaged in thinking with the grantees about how we go forward. So we want to make sure we cover that topic. So we got a very positive forecast from the city economist, which is great news. And for those who were here for cut times, this is really much better. He predicts that we will have $8.1 million in additional revenue available for grants over the current fiscal year, which we are now more than halfway through, and then the remaining 2 years in this 3-year grant cycle. He makes some predictions that go further out, but I am disinclined to think much about those at this point because they've been rather volatile in the past, so I don't know that that's as relevant for the moment. When we met with you all to kind of get your feedback on the process and the funding process, I know I mentioned to you that I thought the revenue forecast was likely to be more positive, and checked in with all of the folks here, actually, about what they thought about doing another RFI. Do people want to do another RFI to let those funds, or would we look at an alternative process? And most everybody felt that they didn't particularly want to go through another RFI process because it is so lengthy and time-consuming, and staff more than agrees with that. It's a huge amount of time and energy for everybody, applicants included, and we just went through it. It takes a long time to run the process, and that would mean the money gets out and being used on a slower time format, which is not ideal. Also, 8.1 million is, although a nice sum, is much less than what we typically let when we let an RFI, so the amount of effort to money is not what we would like. And then the other thing is, we've got a lot of planned work with grantees that we would like to get going on, and now that we're kind of finished thinking through what happened last time and where we want to make changes. A lot of that would have to be foregone if we went through another whole elaborate funding process. So we wanted to kind of check in with you about, what folks feel about that. Are we okay to start thinking at our next meeting, how do we want to do this, and are we likely to take an RFI off the table or not? So I'd be curious to hear what people think about that. Oh.
Anybody want to turn their mic on with any comments? I'll say I think it's a good idea not to do an additional request for investment round, and to have staff come forward with some recommendations that we can then massage and make into reality. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I would concur, and certainly for the reasons that you suggested, the amount of time, the effort that it also requires not only of staff, but of our grantees, all the organizations that might be submitting, the time and effort that they put in for, even though it's a generous amount of money spread across that much time, I'm not sure that it would be what they would choose, and it's my understanding that they, in the past, have also, I think, had some input around this kind of decision. Is that true in prior times?
We make the decisions at public meetings, and there's time for input in that. It's not a formal input process in the same way, because the decision, it's been different things at different times, honestly. It's depended on kind of when it's happened in the grant cycle. Last time that we had additional funds, it was right after we did a grant round for kind of some similar reasons. There were changes in forecast, and there were additional funds that were unspent by grantees as well, and so they left fund balance. And so we ended up doing some additional funding of people who had applied or gotten money in the previous round. So we did not run a separate round, for instance, and there was time for input and public testimony, but it was not going out for 4 months of public input process or things like that like we do in our regular round.
I'm in favor, and although we made some tough choices, of the programs we did choose to fund, I believe the record would show that, especially the last day we met, and maybe the last 2 days we met, we were making decisions based on quantity of money, not quality of program. And I think it would be great to go back and visit those programs and remind ourselves of those decisions as part of the process.
Ditto with the previous 3 recommendations.
Okay, so we'll ask staff to come back with some recommendations. We'll certainly have a public meeting around those recommendations and opportunity for us to deliberate on those.
We should have ample time to discuss. We don't have to make a decision at the next set of meetings, and we can take a couple meetings to do it if that's what it takes. So I'm not necessarily looking to run through it, but I think you're right. We have plenty of opportunities to look back at what we did, as well as other options for things we funded in the past that we had to stop funding due to cuts. So I think we'll bring a whole suite of options, and you guys can think through them. Okay, we will put that on the agenda for the next meeting, and we send out, just so you know, the notes of all this meeting, so this announcement will go out to the general public in writing as well, since we have a pretty small crowd here.
So Lisa, something you said caught my ear, and it was different than the way I've been thinking about it. If not right and wrong, I'd just like to get it clear. So when we say we're not going to go out to RFP, that doesn't just mean that we would look at increasing the funding of the programs we chose last time. It would mean potentially funding new programs?
In that case, the thing I was thinking of in my mind was an example of an initiative that we funded in the last levy period that, due to the significant decrease in revenue, was not able to be renewed, and despite a professional evaluation that showed good outcomes. So that was the example that popped into my mind. It's a child care initiative. We'll give you some more. You weren't around during those days, and so we will come up with a larger suite of options than what you might want to do, and you can begin to talk through what you think you might want to do. And I think that's probably it's going to take some process to get there. It's not going to be just a one-shot thing. Does that make sense? Okay. I guess I have to keep that on. Okay. That's too many for the next one. I know. That's what I feel like, and I'm very bad at video games. Okay. So we will take this up at the next meeting or two and go from there. And then now we're going to move on to some of the sort of paperwork that staff has put together in the last few months and give you kind of headlines. We've sent a lot of this stuff to you, and I don't know if people have had time to read it or not, but we figured we would give you the headlines at least and go from there. Some of these things have relevance to our discussion about what we might want to improve, so that's partly why we're going over it here. Improve or change.
All right, I'm going to start just kind of helping us think about the framework that we've just set through the grant-making process that we just completed, and the way in which we're going to assure that we deliver on the goals that we set in that process. So, and gauge whether or not we're delivering on those goals. So just kind of a recap reminder that you did in this last, in advance of this funding process, adopt goals for the levy in each of our program areas, as well as sort of service or program strategies to achieve those goals in each of the areas. And the adoption of those goals and strategies was informed extensively by the public input that was gathered over a 4-month period, as well as review of local data and national research on best practices. So we have those goals and strategies laid out. And with using those, each of the requests for investment documents were grounded in those goals and strategies, and that was, as you know, what you ended up funding. For us to be able to account for and gauge progress toward our goals, we will do the following work, which is a lot of what we've done in the past, but it has solidified now that we have goals and strategies in place, which we hadn't had in the past. So we collect data annually from the grantees that we fund. We have for a long time, but we've gotten more and more clear on the metrics that we would like to use in order to gauge progress. And the 5 main metrics that we'll be looking at going forward are, first, service goals that each of the grants have. So there are grant agreements with each grantee that specify the number of children to be served and the specific types of services and the amounts of service to be offered. So we monitor those on a regular basis. Second, we look at the demographics of the clients served in each program. There's a large body of research that suggests that the children's demographics are largely correlated with their outcomes, and so looking at demographic data of the children served in our programs helps us understand whether or not we're reaching children with the greatest barriers to positive outcomes, including children of color and children living in poverty in our community. Third, we look at client participation in services. So each of the grant agreements that we have specify the participation expectations of clients in those programs based on what is most likely to produce program outcomes. And we look at whether and how programs are having their clients participate at those expected levels. Fourth, each grant has specified program outcomes that they're trying to achieve as a result of the services. And most contracts have multiple outcomes. We look at whether and how clients are reaching those outcomes. And finally, fifth, we look at program staff turnover. As you might imagine, staff turnover can have a very negative impact on programs, particularly for programs that are very relationship-based with the families. And it's also very costly for programs to hire and retrain staff as a result of turnover. So we look at turnover trends in hopes of minimizing its impact on the services that we fund. Data collected from grantees around those 5 metrics are used in 3 ways. We look at the individual performance of the grantee itself in those 5 areas. We use those data to aggregate across each program area to understand trends and performance of groups of grants or all grantees in a particular program area. And then we aggregate performance across all grants in the entire levy, and again, look at our program and levy performance in that way. Altogether, these data that we collect and the 3 ways that we look at, 3 ways that we use them are our way of working toward a continuous quality improvement framework for the levy. So this is kind of what we've set out as the way in which we'll account for the investments that were just made, and it will be our guide for any future investments as well. And you will soon hear data on the past 5 years levy using mostly this framework approach, but keeping in mind that we didn't have adopted goals and strategies in the past. Any questions on this framework? Thanks. As John just reminded me, all of these documents that we are going to be discussing at today's meeting are available on the Children's Levy website, and also we'd be happy to provide hard copies for folks.
So one thing I will add to Meg's presentation that comes up a little bit in the 5-year report is we don't have any particular metrics that are geared toward any kind of cultural responsiveness tracking or understanding how our organization's doing on cultural responsiveness, and that's something that we're going to think about how do we do and how should we do it. So that's going to be, I would say, something that'll be in development for a year or two. We're going to have to consult what folks can track, how we can gather, how we might think about that. So the document, I suppose, is a living document in that sense, so that I think it's possible we'll be adding some things to it in terms of how we think about accountability and how we report back to you on what happens. So that said, I'm going to give you some headlines from the 5-year report. So for those of you who've been around a little longer, you've probably had to sit through one really boring data presentation, and we decided we would try not to do that again and not do slides and all that. So I'm just going to do kind of some quick shots of what we found out and kind of what it means for the future, or how we might go about changing things as we go forward. So this year instead of doing it, we did do an annual report, and that will be available on the web as soon as I get the rest of the data from the school districts, which are really lagging this year. But the rest of it's completed. So those annual pieces are done if anybody ever needs to see them. The 5-year is looking at the sort of second levy period, so the whole 5 years of investment. And as Meg said, we look across those metrics to try to get a sense, how do we do? So using those as a guide, I'll give you the headlines from each category, so you can kind of hear, to the extent if you didn't have time to read, what happened. So in service provision, pretty much goals were met, and grantees served more children and caregivers than they were obligated to serve. So that was pretty much all good. We always watch for, sometimes serving more people is not a good thing, because it can just mean that many people are replacing each other in a program. So you have to, that's why we track the participation rates in addition to just the service numbers, because that gives you a sense for how many people are really staying and completing that service. So that we'll come to in a second, but overall, in terms of beating service goals, people are ahead of the game. We also had when we did the 2009 levy investments, we had investment goals that we set through that RFI process. One of which was to increase investment in culturally specific programs, and one of which was to increase investment in services that are available to people who live or go to school in East Portland. And that was defined as east of 82nd Avenue. So we were able to track culturally specific investments over time, and in the last year of the first levy period, it was about 24%. Doesn't like me. And for the total of the 5 years, we invested about 31% in culturally specific programs. So that's total resources, 31% of total levy revenues. So that was an increase. So in that sense, we met that goal. As far as investments in East Portland, we didn't have a way to track improvement in that because we hadn't tracked zip code beforehand. But we did track it in the second levy period, and 38% of the people that we served either lived or went to school in East Portland. About 25% of the city resides in East Portland, so we know we're reaching further into that population than they represent in the general population, which is kind of our marker for how we try to assess, are we increasing access to areas or people or groups of people that are disadvantaged or have greater issues or poorer outcomes. And East Portland, I think most people know the data. I don't have to go through it on East Portland, but it's more diverse, more poor, and that's why we're targeting that area. And also, not only that, but a dearth of services has typically been located in the center. So we know we've done decently. We'll be able to see if we've increased it this time around from that 38%. On demographics, there's lots of detail here. I will not really go into a lot of it. If you want more, you can read the report in more detail. Sort of the highlights are that we're serving more than 50% of the people that we serve are young children, 0 to 8, which I think was really in line with a pretty old goal that we had before everybody but Dan was here pretty much, in terms of front-loading our prevention services and making sure that we're hitting kids when they're at the young ages. So I was pleased to see that held true for the whole levy. About 64% of the children served were of color. That compares to about 50% of the Portland school, it's all the schools in Portland, so not just Portland Public. About 50% of that school population are children of color. So we're, again, serving above what the ratio is in the general population. We serve greater proportions of all races and ethnicities other than white and Asian than these groups compose in the school population as well. So the groups that are most likely to have the disparate outcomes that achievement gaps, et cetera, that we track were all served much more than their presence in the population. So in terms of access, I feel like we have a decent marker for offering access to programming to kids who are projected to have poor outcomes based on demographics. We did find some gaps in certain program areas in terms of service of particular populations, and most of those were addressed in the investments we just made. So we'll see now how the trends come out in the next levy period. For program participation, the main point that I would take from that is that we saw early exits decline, and we saw the number or the percentage of people meeting the participation minimum, which is the sort of the minimum the program sets that they think they need before an outcome could happen, a good outcome can happen, increased. So you saw the bad stuff going down, the good stuff going up, and I think that is that's the main point. And also I think it bears some relationship to people paying attention to that. This is the first time we asked people to track that, and I think we saw it kind of steadily march up and steadily march down, which I think in the what's measured gets done theory. There was some variation in early exit rates between program areas. You can see the report for more details. I think there's explanations in certain program areas. There's higher turnover. And conversely, in some program areas, particularly early childhood, people stay in services, partly based on the kind of services we fund. With outcomes, doing well, grantees are doing well. They're meeting a high percentage of the outcomes set in their contracts. The 5-year average is 88% of outcomes met. So over on the whole, when people talk about the fact, in general talk about outcomes, we don't really have a lot. I mean, people are doing a good job on that. The outcomes, fall into general categories, but we track the ones usually that are specifically related to the program services. Staff turnover, tracking that data has led us to be able to get kind of a baseline in general. We look at it's been between 15 and 20% turnover annually for the levy programs. So that's about what we can expect. So that gives us a baseline to measure is somebody really over, is one group of programs or one program area over that. Go ahead.
So I think this is where, taking a harder look at the data would be helpful, because it may mean that our best performers are turning over people at 5% and our lowest 20% are turning over at 80%. And so it normalizes at 20%. And so that wouldn't be a very good target to focus on under that circumstance. And I don't know if you've drilled down enough to know whether there's a finer point we can put on that.
What we do is we look at each, so one of the things that we use these metrics for is we assess them for each grantee. So one thing we give each grantee is, in other words, we'll give them their rate, we'll give them the program area rate, sometimes a sub-program area rate. So like if they're a home visiting program, we might look at other home visiting programs. And we let them know how they performed in relation to that mean that the whole group performs. And then we also look at the levy-wide rate. So we kind of try to look at all that we're looking at sometimes 3 or 4 variables or averages about how folks perform. And then we're working with the grantee on an individual basis to say, you are really off the line here in terms of everyone else in your program area is doing much better on staff turnover, what's going on? And so that's where that comes in. And I had, for instance, I had a grantee for a while that had really problem turnover. And we really did focus on, I let them know that was a major issue. And it's one I brought up with the committee numerous times. And they have finally stabilized it. So, I mean, it's partly sometimes organizations go through transition times and that creates difficulty in turnover. But I think that's where that fine point comes in. I would say rates that stay like this that are fairly stable over time at the levy-wide suggest that we're unlikely to get below 15% levy-wide, because I haven't seen it pretty much every year. It hasn't been lower than 15%.
Right, but I guess the way I'm thinking about it is if, assuming we have a bell curve of performers, if we don't assume everybody's performing at the same level, we have a bell curve, then if the top 20% of our performers are turning over staff at a certain rate, I'd want to know that, and I think we should be targeting that, not trying to keep all of our performers within the general mean or median. I always get mixed up on mean and median, so I hazard to use that. But I guess, said another way, I'd like to see it, and not because, it's the be-all or end-all or only data point, but if we do have a top 20% of performers, what do they look like? And we should be advocating to our other 80% how to get there, not how to reach average.
Can I ask a clarifying question in your example, Mitch? Are you thinking about the top 20% within its peer group? Because for example, I mean, early childhood, for example, as a program area tends to have lower turnover than child abuse prevention intervention. And I think we have to think about what's endemic to the field. So if you can clarify a little bit more what you're thinking in that example, that would be helpful. Because I hear where you're going with it. I get the analysis and the way of constructing that, and I think it's something we could think about internally. So if you could walk it through a little bit more.
Yeah, that, great point, and I think that's where you'd have to look at the information and the data and say, yeah, we can, this peer group is this bell curve, and it only includes this many people, whereas these 3 program areas really look more alike than they look different. We'll put them all into one and create a bell curve for them. So, and I just don't know, you guys are so much more on top of what those programs look like and are constructed like to judge that, but it's just something I'd like to see.
I think there's another subtlety here that I realize. So you're talking about, I'm not sure if you're only talking about performance on staff turnover, because the way you're saying it, you're saying our top 20% of performers, and I don't know if you mean only on that variable, or if you're thinking in some larger sense. Are you only thinking on that about staff turnover?
I would say anything we're judging programs on, I would like to see. I mean, I think we should be driving towards the best, not the average. And so if that means, if we only have one way to judge that, then it's one. But if we have more ways to slice it, staff turnover, however, whatever, I think we could probably come up with more than one thing.
Well, you're right. I mean, I think part of it, I mean, think about what the average in this situation means. I think that's the only other thing I would say is that because you're looking at a particular group, if they were all high performing, the ones who are average would look average. In other words, we're just taking what their performance is and averaging it, if that makes sense. So if let's just suppose that, like, for instance, on outcomes, right, it's not a bell curve of all possible organizations in the human service field, for instance, or the bell curve of all home visiting programs that exist in Oregon or something like that. It's one little subsection of programs. So that we've tried to caution with grantees about that when we're calling an average, it's an average among this group. It's not an average in the field or something like that, or an average in some other sense. So I think to say that average performance is necessarily at some standard level average is, I'm not sure, right. In other words, we've got 88% of the outcomes were met. So that tells me that pretty much every grantee is meeting outcomes that they're supposed to be meeting. So I'm not sure who I would call a high performer in that sense. They're all high performers if they're all meeting their outcomes. And now there's different levels of rigor, et cetera, et cetera. There's other ways we can make distinctions. But I understand where you're going, and the idea is to drive quality improvement and drive bringing down turnover in this particular case. And I think that's something that Lisa and I have had a lot of discussions about, because foster care and child abuse have the highest turnover rates, and also are working with the neediest and riskiest populations of people. And so I think that's going to be a focus for this coming levy. What can we do? What can we do as a funder to support changing that and turning it around? So that's kind of, I think you're right that we need to drive toward better rates for everybody, and particularly where there's significant issues. So that's the kind of my only response back. I don't know if I have a composite. If I can give you, we don't have a mathematical way to composite all of these metrics, and I would need more statistical background before I can suggest that. Meg, that'll be your next project.
I'm sitting here, I'm thinking it through, and I get the concept of it, but I am struggling with ways to think about how to operationalize it also in a way that's easy to understand for the grantees. Like if we started holding them accountable to something in that way, how to explain it. And it already feels complicated when we say, here are 5 metrics. Here is your performance on this particular metric averaged over a period of time compared to your peers, compared to the levy-wide average, and we're already giving them that information, and then for that particular metric, making a judgment call or assessing basically like whether or not we felt that performance was out of range in a negative or positive way, comparing it one standard deviation away from the average. So we're already kind of creating this very technical methodology, and when I think about what you're suggesting, I'm not suggesting it's not worth pursuing, but I'm acknowledging that it is also technical and may end up becoming more difficult to use, but I get the idea. And I'm wondering if maybe we're already kind of doing what you're suggesting, and we just haven't explained it well enough, and that's a whole other topic.
Well, one thing is that I think because it's been a year since anybody's seen, we're about to give you these. We basically take these composites. So for each program area, we'll have all of the grantees, and we have all of these metrics across a page, and we'll tell you kind of who fell in the middle of the group. So average in that sense only, okay? So who fell within that bell curve and who's one standard deviation above or below, and that's high or low on the metrics. So then basically you could see if somebody had poor metrics, it doesn't really happen that way in the sense that we don't have any grantees in the most recent round that we funded, and I can't say going forward, but where there were problem metrics with the same grantee on many dimensions. Usually it's one dimension that somebody has an issue on. And so then we work on that issue, trying to rectify, is the more typical situation. So when you get these charts for last year, you'll get a sense, and you can see whether that gives you some idea about what we're talking about. So let's continue the conversation in that context. I think that makes sense.
Can I ask a question? So how can we tell if anyone's making a difference? And I think that's maybe it. How do we know that they're truly making a difference? Yeah, they met their goals, but have they really made a difference? I think that's kind of what we're trying to get at a little bit. How do we know the organization, we gave you this money, you said you were going to serve these kids, you served them, but did it really change some lives? Those outcomes, changing some lives of some kids, especially in the foster care system, where the numbers are really bad. I know we can't change it for everybody and DHS and all that, but the organizations that we're serving that come to us, that come and say, we're doing this, we're doing that. Are you really doing it? It says, how do you tell that?
I think that's really what the outcomes are for. I mean, that's what the outcome will be, something along those lines. Like one of the things we want to check in young children is that they're developing properly, and if they're not developing properly, they're being referred, and if they're being referred, they're getting the service to help them develop on track. So I mean, there's these kinds of things that we want to have happen. Or in after-school programs, we want to see school attendance increase or stay below the level of chronic absence. Well, did that happen? I mean, those are what the outcomes are. So I would say they're not. We haven't broken those out here, but we certainly have all that information, and that's the kind of thing that to me is making a difference. Is that we're having a positive outcome with a kid. I mean, the overall impact of this particular piece of funding on various societal level trajectories, those are much harder to isolate and probably out of range for what we could do as a staff. We need professionals on that one, different kind of professionals.
Yeah. Well, and I guess I think your question also though raises questions about quality of the outcomes that programs are tracking, and I think that's kind of one of the bodies of work that in this current levy period we want to undertake, and there are places where we know that there's some room to make improvement around asking folks to think a little bit differently about what they've been tracking in the past. There's new research that's come out in the past 5 years since grantees that we've funded in the past are now continuing to fund went through a process of really examining, like, is this the outcome we ought to be tracking? Is this the tool we should be using? And so coming back to them now that we all know more as a community and as a country and as a society about how to better measure things, and asking them to revisit that work. And that was, Lisa was sort of mentioning earlier that is a big piece of work we'd like to take on as staff, and if we run another RFI process, it's that kind of work that we won't have time to do because it's a big lift, it takes a lot of time. And so anyway, I think to answer your question, I think we do the best we can right now, but we know there's always room for improvement for asking people to think more or differently about how do we tell that story.
Yeah. And I think that's what we want to hear, the story. So how do I know that if a woman that was in a domestic violence situation really used one of those daycare units, was it really helpful for her? So I think it would be nice to hear some of those stories, some of that feedback coming back, so that we'll know that, okay, yes, we're moving in the right direction. Because we know that everything's not going to change, but did that daycare center help you get that restraining order, or you spent that time there, or were your kids actually getting those therapeutic activities that they needed there? So is that organization doing what it was, because everybody can put it on paper, but is there a story from a family or from a woman that can say?
Yeah, we've got a lot of those stories. We tell a lot of those on our website or through the media or in our annual reports or in the newsletter on the website. We can always do a better job. We are going to revamp the website to do a lot more storytelling, to have story banks, to be using our grantees as ambassadors and being ambassador for us, and they'll be an ambassador for, and being, sharing stories and getting the word out. I think we do a fairly good job of that, but we can always improve. We're doing videos now too. So again, it's just, getting the word out and getting the message out and telling the great stories, because they're all there. So we can certainly get them to you if they're on the website and they're in newsletters and our reports. And
Well, I was just saying, because if you're sitting here, you hear all this and you take some knocks, it'd be, it'd be nice to know that you took some knocks for some good reasons and that it was truly worth it, that someone is really, or people are really getting the help that they deserve to get.
And the grantees are getting really good about sharing those stories with their grant managers, and then they get passed on to me, and we're getting those out too, so.
Thank you.
We'll get you the latest round because we just had a reporting round.
I didn't,
So anyway, we just got a new round of stories, and so we'll send them on to you, because Mary Gay usually kind of coagulates them all. We pass them to her and from reports, and you can read some, because they're. I mean, we all of us have cried at our desks. I mean, literally from some of these stories, they're just unbelievable. So we definitely read those, and people definitely take the time to provide them. So we'll pass them on. I guess we've become so quantitative in our mindset. We always think about giving you a lot of numbers. We don't think about giving you the story. So that's a good point of improvement. We'll do that and change that communication to you all, because we do it more to the outside community and that facing out world, but less to you all, I'd say. Okay, one last thing on the 5-year report, and then we will move on. So I'll make sure we have time to talk about where we're going in the future and feedback. So the other thing that, and this is sort of to the point that I made at the end of Meg's thing about what we track and how we look at metrics. The All Hands Raised collaborative that is working on equity has sort of a deep dive and created an equity assessment tool that organizations can use to understand how well they're doing. That tool has got 9 different dimensions, and under each dimension, there's lots of questions that you are meant to ask yourself, your organization. And in our case, I think potentially the organizations we're funding, some of whom are doing this equity analysis, some maybe who haven't started. I thought it made sense for us to look at that and look at some of the standards that are suggested by these questions that you're meant to ask, to understand, at least on some of the points that are germane to the things that we look at, the data, the demographic type of information we collect, those sorts of things. Are we meeting those standards that are suggested by the tool? And if not, what might we want to think about doing? So that, I think, will form the kind of questions we ask going forward about, how can we do better, or will we want to measure different things, or if so, and how much work for the grantees. For instance, disaggregating data is one of the things that has made it, folks make a big point about in that tool. And while we disaggregate service data, we don't disaggregate participation or outcome data. And mostly that's because, remember, this would be a burden for the grantees to do. So this is something they have to do. We don't have a database in which we are collecting all this information. So that's been part of the hesitation, is it's going to be more work and more capacity building we have to do with them. But we are going to ask them to go forward and do disaggregated participation data for this year. So we'll kind of see what that looks like. So we'll understand, here's the service population. That's how it shakes out. You serve 20% African Americans, 20% Asians, and 60%, I have that right, 60% white people. What did the participation look like as compared to that? So we'll see what we get, and we'll come back to you when we get that data to sort of see what it helps us understand. But in general, I think it raises issues about what kind of goals do we set, and do we have specific sort of other specific equity goals we want to be setting? And how would we decide what they are? I think it thinks about what data we should track and what we should ask grantees to track. How should we evaluate the impact of our investments on communities of color? So I think disaggregating data is one of the ways we look at that. Are there other ways we should be considering? And I think the type and frequency of communication with communities of color. We've mostly gone out and involved communities around our funding rounds. We don't have standing advisory committees or anything like that. And I think that's something we might want to consider as well going forward. So those are the kind of things that we'll be convening grantees to talk about, and also bringing back to you for discussion as we move forward. So I just wanted to highlight that and let you know it's on our minds and on our radar, and we're going to try to figure out what next, basically, over these next few months.
Lisa, when you convene the grantees, will we be able to attend like we did before? Would it be like an open forum or something like that?
It's probably going to be in smaller program groups because when we're talking about, that's often how we bring people together because we have other reasons to talk to them in those groups, if that makes sense. So, or we may, I mean, we haven't even figured it out, to be honest. So I'd be happy to invite you if you'd like to come. Would people like to have notice of those things at least, in case you want to join? Okay.
Okay, so we're going to move on next to the investment expectations, results and implications.
That was it. That was what you just got.
Oh, that's what we just got. Okay.
I think that
Okay.
Meg will give you a few quick headlines on some stats on where we went. It's going to just more frame up the feedback.
Did you have a question? Okay. So we're transitioning out of the accountability framework discussion and performance over the last 5 years and moving into our kind of reflecting on our most recent grant making process. When you last met in September, you were provided some overview information and analysis about how well the investments that you made did compared to your allocation goals in the program areas and the strategies. We had time at that point to have crunched that information, analyzed it, and given it back to you, but there was a bunch of other things that we wanted to look at we didn't have time to do before that meeting, and so I'm going to give you the highlights of that analysis. And kind of remind you where we just were with the funding process before Lisa Hansel talks about the different feedback that we gathered on people's experiences in that process and what it suggests for improvements we ought to make for future funding processes. So just a reminder, we had 122 applications submitted from 62 organizations this spring. 48% of the applications were funded. So we funded fewer than half of what was received. Of the total dollars requested, there were $83 million requested. 32 million, or 40% of those requests, were awarded. So again, much less than half of what was requested was awarded. Applications from culturally specific programs received a slightly higher portion of the dollars they requested compared to mainstream programs. So for example, culturally specific programs requested a total of $27 million and they received about 44% of that. Mainstream programs requested $55 million and they received about 37% of that. So culturally specific programs received slightly more than a higher portion of what they requested compared to mainstream programs. Applications from higher scoring programs, so applications that scored 86 or higher, comprised 80% of our funded applications. So we tended to fund higher scoring applications.
So is that been true historically? And can we look at, I'd be interested to see what the failure rate of the below 85% programs, and failure being a relative term, but performance, I guess is a better way to say it. I mean, is there empirical data to support the fact that we're choosing the highest scored programs, or does it, are the programs that we're choosing below that line still performing well?
I'm going to clarify what I think you're asking for, which is if we look at the scores of past applicants that we've funded, what portion of those that scored 85 or lower sort of were funded by us and no longer are funded? Is that what you're defining as a failure?
Well, as my little give and take with Lisa earlier points out, trying to identify how to say what's a high-performing program and a low-performing program is a challenge. But
yeah.
Yes, I mean, one indicator would be, have any of the programs that we funded that scored low still in the program? Or how we can shake it out. But
yeah.
Obviously, they scored low for a reason. Their application didn't impress as much as others. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they should perform less or at a lower level. But when I was grading it, I had to make that assumption. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
if scoring doesn't equate to performance, then why are we scoring?
Right. So can I go a step further to clarify what you're asking for? Because I'm trying to think in my head of how to set up the information so we can do that analysis. But I think what you're really wanting to see is a correlation between score and the performance metrics that we had, in whatever way we can construct it to make some logical sense. And I think that can be done.
I don't have the answer. I mean, I don't have the answer. We've never really done that. We haven't gone back to look at what did they score, because remember, they score, you know, that sometimes it's 5 years ago that they got a score on an application. And also, I mean, one thing is that sometimes things shift over time. So, you know, there's some of that, but we've never done it. So I think the answer is we could, and we can see what it yields. I don't know.
Yeah, and so I'm going to ask for data, probably at least one more time, and I fully admit that the answer we get may not be worth anything, meaning that, okay, here's the answer, but really when you look at the factors or the whatever, it's really not worthy of giving it any credit. So I'm not saying it's going to impress me, but I am saying that I would like to see that. And as long as I'm kind of talking about the same subject, I noted that of the programs that we picked that scored low, a higher percentage of those programs had been funded previously. And so the same, you know, as I'm thinking through it, is that because they were funded previously and did a good job, so it influenced us to choose them, even though they're low score? Or, I mean, just being transparent, or were we playing politics and funding a program for a reason other than the quality of their outcomes?
Those are good questions, and I think we'd have to look at each of those on a case-by-case basis. I do know that the ones that were funded in, because there were some that scored 85 or lower that were funded that we hadn't funded in the past, right? And so we had no track record by which to go with there. And then there were some that scored 85 or lower that we had funded in the past, and yes, we did have a track record. And my knowledge of having done this analysis was that we had a track record that indicated that they performed well. Which is why they probably landed, I think one other sort of lens on this is, did they land in staff's recommendations or not, right? So yeah, I think we can figure out a way to make sense of those data to provide the type of analysis you want to look at, Mitch. I think that's really doable with what we have. Let's see. Well, you just kind of gave me my last headline, Mitch, which was that programs we funded in the past tended to be more likely to be funded than programs that were new applicants or new proposals to the levy. There is one error in the data that were presented to you in September that I wanted to rectify here, which is that in September we reported on allocation goals. One of your allocation goals was that 30% of your funding would go to culturally specific programs, and at that point in time we said that 33% was awarded to culturally specific programs, but when I calculated those figures I made a huge error, and it was actually 37% of our awarded funding went to culturally specific programs, so revising that figure.
It's nice to have good news.
Any questions on those sort of the applicant pool data, for lack of a better way to describe it? Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I do have a question on the investment goals for program area strategies, but I don't want to jump you if you're going to keep going in your report.
I was done, so go ahead.
So as I look at and kind of recall at child abuse prevention intervention, we were 7% down on therapeutic intervention, and as I recall, we kind of struggled to find programs that met that definition, and it did, as I was reading through that, it occurred to me that if we still think that's the right way to go, I'd like to at least talk about what we could be doing now to try to germinate some of those therapeutic options, so the next time we fund, we'll have more options or better fitting options on that front.
Well, it's, as you know, that was a new strategy area, and the committee actually went back and forth in setting that goal between 70 and 30%, and what did we end up setting it? 60-40 and 70-30. There was kind of a split in what we should do on that. So that's one thing to consider there. Another thing to consider is we heard a lot in the public input session about this is a huge need, having the therapeutic intervention. One of the things that we weren't as aware of were all the complexities involved with who should pay for these services and are they already covered by other sources. So just another thing to consider in that whole discussion and look is what I would have to say at this point.
Especially with healthcare reform.
Right.
It's been a major issue of like figuring out where does the money come from to fund therapeutic and should it be coming from a source like us or not? Well, this is the thing. I can't get a straight answer out of anybody, Serena. That's probably why.
Serena said they still don't know.
Okay, why don't we go ahead to Lisa's going to sort of tell you what was feedback now in the headline version.
Okay, so we consulted or we requested feedback from 4 primary stakeholder groups, those being the allocation committee members, our volunteer reviewers, the community at large, including applicants and others on our in our database, and Levy staff. At the September allocation committee meeting, we provided staff kind of feedback and reflection on the process, as well as some of the information that we had received from our reviewers. Since that time, we've done interviews with each of the allocation committee members to hear their feedback, and we also had an electronic survey that we sent out to our entire database. About 1,000 people received that. So with that information, staff has analyzed all the information that we received from those various sources and have summarized by theme the things that we heard. Before I share those themes, just want to point out some things I'd like you to keep in mind regarding the surveys. We had very good response from the reviewers. We had given those surveys to them at the completion of the review period, and they were basically a captive audience and turned those surveys in at a rate of 89%. However, with the electronic survey, we had a poor response, I would say, 7%. About 72 out of 1,000 people responded. There are also limitations with doing surveys. There's no opportunity to probe deeper into their response or get clarification or understand why you might rate something favorably or unfavorably. We just have that basic information as compared to interviews where you can get more information and do that probing. Some cautions regarding potential bias in the community surveys. Like I already stated, it's a small survey sample. Almost all of the respondents were applicants, 97% were applicants. We didn't on the survey ask people, were you funded or not funded? We don't know how many of the responses came from we don't know the number of organizations that are represented in those responses. We don't know if several people from one program or organization responded to the survey. So just some things to keep in mind regarding limitations there. And a recommendation for the future, if we wanted to get more information, richer information, perhaps consider a third-party person to do a qualitative kind of assessment and go and specifically talk with stakeholders that we didn't hear from this time through this process, just for future. So with all those limitations, the headlines, the key findings, since we asked different stakeholders different questions, there weren't a lot of the same themes, but what we did get through this is some key areas that we should look at to see if there are modifications that could be made to improve the process in the future. The first thing that all stakeholders said, either directly or implied, was that this needs to be a longer process. Allow more time for community input, allow more time for the application review, for public testimony and advocacy, as well as for decision making. The second thing that we heard as a theme was that from both allocation committee members and applicants was that the public testimony period didn't allow for meaningful discussion, and applicants specifically said it didn't feel to them that the public testimony influenced decisions in any way. And moving on to the next area is around the decision-making process. Applicants and allocation committee members expressed frustration with the process. Applicants felt that the criteria, scores, and staff recommendations weren't used consistently, and allocation committee members would like an opportunity to discuss their preferences with each other to have a better understanding of the priorities that each bring, and also to have more opportunity to talk with applicants and get their questions answered and learn more about the programs being proposed outside of a public forum. So those were the overall, and then going by each stakeholder group, the reviewers, there were 70 responses, and we asked them really to provide feedback on the review part of the process. So their responses were around scoring, and they'd like more, scoring, incorporate more quality into the scoring, so maybe getting at some of the things that Mitch talks about versus just did they answer the question, and anyways, I won't go into detail there because we're not going to be talking about that today. And then also about what PCL expectations are of the reviewers in terms of time and group discussions. They also talked about reviewer orientation and training and the kinds of things that they would like to see in the future there. Even though, one other thing that, just to point out with their responses, the thing we specifically asked them for improvements, and 31 of the responses that we received had to do with positive comments that they really appreciated being part of the process. They thought it was well organized, clear instructions. So that's good too when they weren't even asked, what did you like? So then the next group, the applicants, I'll call them applicants, even though it was applicants in community, since the large majority were applicants. We did the electronic survey. On that survey, we asked people to indicate their level of agreement with a series of questions using a Likert scale, and we also asked for narrative comments. Two key findings came from the Likert scale, and one was that the Levy did a great job of communicating with people about the process and when allocation committee meetings were. And the second finding was that the highest level of dissatisfaction had to do with the grants awarded, where 38% of the responses disagreed with the statement, "I'm satisfied with the grants made in this funding process." And as Meg pointed out with the statistics that she shared, I would say that this isn't necessarily surprising given the fact that fewer than half of the applications submitted were funded and only 39% of the dollars were awarded. I would say that there would likely always be some level of dissatisfaction when the demand exceeds the resources available. So to keep that in mind as well. So with the narrative part of the responses or the feedback, about half of the people that responded provided a narrative response. And the things that they were most concerned about were decision-making, as I talked about earlier. And the thing that people said, the most common comment was about the perceived inconsistent use of criteria, scores, and staff recommendations. Some also said that it appeared that the decisions were made before the committee met. And then also another theme area in this area from this group is around policy, criteria, and priorities. And some felt that the criteria were overly specific and prescribed. And then the third theme area was around public testimony and advocacy, feeling that the public testimony didn't necessarily influence decision making. The time allotted for testimony was too short to allow for meaningful discussion, and the need to develop public testimony and advocacy guidelines that allow opportunity for equal access to allocation committee members. So then the next feedback group was the allocation committee members, and individual interviews were held with each of you. And there were 2 theme areas, one around public testimony. People seem to like separating decision-making meetings from hearing about the programs and recommendations. However, the public testimony format doesn't work well. There's too much information to process in too little time. And some suggestions were hearing testimony in multiple settings in locations other than downtown, and also to find more ways to get input from parents. And decision-making was the other theme area, and again, need more time for interaction between allocation committee members and the applicants. Some suggestions were perhaps have a 2-step process with fewer finalists that the allocation committee members could interview. Another idea was to assign each member to a program area to develop expertise and knowledge of organizations. And another is to change the format of public testimony so it's more interactive. And the other thing around decision-making was the need for more discussion and exchange of information between the allocation committee members. And one possible idea was to have allocation committee members meet with each other in groups of 2 or fewer by yourself, which is what you had, in groups of 2 prior to the decision-making to better understand each member's individual priorities and rationale. And then you heard staff input before and in September, and so just really wanted to highlight the 2 areas that had to do with what you guys are going to be discussing today, around adopting goals and strategies, and that was a recommendation to find a better way to screen applicants for their fit with goals and strategies before they moved on to the next stage. And then staff also felt like the funding process timeline could be expanded to allow more time for quality improvements. That's it.
Thank you. Any questions?
When you say expanding the timeline, a longer time for them to respond, longer than 6 weeks, I think is what I read, is what it currently is.
I think that people were, we heard input on. It's really annoying. Anyway, I think that we heard lengthen different parts of the process. I mean, all parts. You know, there was comments on every part. So that's what we wanted to raise with you all about which part do you think is important to change and why? Yeah.
I want to make the comment that I think that, you know, we all as volunteers, I know take this very seriously. Every applicant that comes forward, taken seriously. There are a range of needs. There are a range of issues. There are so many organizations, programs within different organizations who are seeking funding in different service areas, and it certainly is a lot of information that I think that certainly for myself as a committee member would benefit from having more time to feel that I had a chance to review applicants, to ask questions. The staff has always been exceedingly helpful and available to me to answer any questions, but the sheer volume of information is pretty considerable. I mean, just when you see the applications coming in, it is a lot. And especially, again, as I say, when it's in all these different areas and how things are quantified or what the best practices are in early childhood. I'm somewhat familiar with those, not so much about foster care. And so I do think that I need to do my homework more, and I think that having more time to do that certainly would benefit me and perhaps my colleagues here to do that, to make sure that I am giving my very best respect and to every organization that comes forward. I think is imperative.
Maybe just following what Julie said, I mean, it seems like from my perspective, our process has gotten better every time. Still not perfect by any means, but I think there's going to be some limits to the amount of time the committee members of the allocation committee are going to want to invest. And it's easy to sit here now and say, yeah, let's have more meetings, let's have more time for Q&A. But when it comes time to start scheduling those meetings and those meetings start running into 3-hour meetings, I think we're going to experience some collective fatigue. But I was intrigued by the idea somebody suggested, I guess, of maybe one allocation committee member each sort of being a liaison to one of, we have 5 committee members, we have 5 investment areas. Oh, we have 6 now. Okay, well, somebody can do double duty.
Dan, you do too.
Yeah. But anyway, I think, that could deal maybe with some of the frustrations also people have about not being able to meet in larger groups than 2. If somebody was the expert, in early childhood, then she could then be better positioned to meet with the other 4 of us or something like that. Anyway, I thought that was a great idea.
I agree with Dan. I think if you had a subject matter, subject expert would be excellent. And also agree with Julie about having more time to review the applications once they come in. I think having more time to just really nail down and read and kind of get a better understanding of what folks were talking about, because it seemed a little bit different once some of them got up there speaking about what they wrote about was a little bit different too. There was inconsistency there as well. So I thought that was a great idea.
So I thought a couple of things as I was thinking about this. And I think, I wonder, part of the frustration of the applicants is, I think, very understandable. And what I think is unique about this group that is different than other organizations I've been involved with that funds is the incredible detail of information we're provided before we stand up here and listen to people. We have raw data, we have raw scores, we have staff recommendations with explanations of why, and we have our own ability to go out and meet these programs and walk the programs and see, touch, and feel them. So we are, while it may not look like it, we're extremely educated about these applications. And then I think it works against us that in turn, we give the same amount of time to programs that are clearly going to get funded, programs that are clearly not going to get funded, and then you got a small group in the middle that are on the border that we need more information from, and that their advocacy could get that, tip the scales. And so I absolutely support a kind of a subject matter expert approach. I would also really like to think about, is there a way that we can devote more time to the bubble group and less time or no time to the obvious ins and obvious outs? And maybe that's just going to be impossible in this process. But from a theoretical standpoint, if we could do that, I think we could create an interaction with at least those programs that would be more fulfilling for them and for us. But I guess to the exclusion of, the other group 2 buckets of programs that I mentioned.
That is a great idea. Because I think, too, working with other organizations, when you're reviewing grant applications, you don't get to spend time with those that are definitely out. And I think that does take up a lot of time when we know that there are folks that are definitely not going to get funded. So, Mitch, I thought that is a very good idea.
Can I ask, because one of the things that has come up in various tables is the idea of some kind of 2-step process where not everybody's in the same boat. So there's some sort of, and some foundations do this, and people do it in many different ways. I'm not trying to suggest how exactly we would do that, but that there's some initial application of some kind that is much shorter and not so onerous to prepare, and then people submit that, and then there's some kind of process by which those are winnowed through and come to a smaller group of applicants, which kind of goes to your thing of, that might make that easier. Like the super strong ones, amongst the finalists, if you will, there'd be super strong ones, less strong ones, and those in the middle, and then maybe effort could be, in other words, if, I mean, again, this is a lot of, I don't want to get into details, but I mean, I could imagine some way that that could be ranked, and you would then have time before you had to make decisions about the finalists. If that makes sense. So that's interesting. Does that interest people, the idea of a two-step? I'm curious what people think about that.
I think that clearly has, I think there's great opportunity in that. I think we see that even on, a national level when there are foundations that say, we're going to be making grants and we already, there are going to be 20 of them. We already have identified 5 programs, and now we have these 15 others. You'll hear from us after we continue to ask you questions. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's also respectful of the organizations that if they, you can't automatically, perhaps you can't say, well, we know you're going to be funded, but to say, you have answered our questions and they don't need to continue to show up and invest their staff time in trying in doing that. So.
No, I like that notion. I mean, I think what you're saying is, I think what a lot of foundations do, right? They have you send in a 1-pager or a 2-pager, and then depending how you resonate, you're invited to submit a longer proposal. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at. Yeah. That sounds intriguing.
The one thing that gave us pause that when we started to think a little bit more about this whole idea of thinking about, we fund how many organizations, Joan? Do we have like? 37. No, I'm sorry, programs. 60. 59 grants, yeah. So, I mean, let's just say we kept funding that number of grants. I mean, if we were to personally talk to all of those organizations, that's 59 organizations we'd have to talk to, or about the specific programs in question. And so I was sort of, I mean, I'm not saying we should continue funding 59 organizations, but if we did, that's what it would mean. So that was something that was a little daunting as I began to consider it. So that's something just to keep in mind in terms of scale, like what would be possible in that regard.
And I don't know the public rules on this, but is there an obligation or entitlement to appear and speak, or is that a option we provide? Meaning that is there anything inappropriate about taking, whether it's a 1-step or 2-step, and then sending out a request to a smaller group to say, we'd like you to come and be prepared to answer questions or interact with the group, and not invite everybody? And you either don't get invited because we don't need any more information from you because you're rock solid, and we think we have enough information to make funding decisions, or vice versa. And so we just invite the people because the formality and the speed of being fair kind of works just the opposite. I think nobody's feeling good about it. So
that's a good question in terms of the legal obligations, or we'll have to check on that.
Yeah, I just don't know, and so I think I would need to figure that out with the story. I mean, I think we still would have some meetings where people could give testimony. I think that would still be allowed, but maybe that wouldn't be the only means of interaction. What I feel like I heard from this group and from other people was that being the only way really to interact, other than to have an email or try to make a meeting with you, that felt unsatisfactory for both sides. So I see what you're getting at, and maybe that could be done.
One of the other questions that staff has helpfully raised is one that I know came out of feedback, or I assume came from feedback, is how should advocacy outside of public meeting testimony be handled? And I had noticed that there was feedback in the one appendix that we were sent ahead of time. I think the comment was that This was from the community said that they need opportunity for equal access in terms of advocacy. And I just wanted to note, and I'm sure it sounds defensive, that I have felt that every applicant has had access to advocacy in terms of contacting me by phone or email. I think we've hope that that's been well heard. I know it's been announced, and I know that over the last, few years now, as long as I've been serving on the allocation committee, I have heard from grantees by email or to come for site visits. And I guess we just really need to continue to remind everyone in the community that that is okay, that, I can't, sometimes when I'm invited to come for a site visit, I can't, simply it doesn't work for my schedule, but that I wouldn't want it to be thought that people don't have a choice of contacting me or anyone else. So I think that's an area where maybe we just need to make that even more clear as much as possible throughout the grant cycle, and then during the time now here after organizations have their programs in place to make sure that we're given opportunities to visit.
And to that end, I would also say, and to not just wait until it's during the cycle, but we can do it like during now too as well. But when they're doing it, when we're going through that allocation cycle, then you're trying to cram everybody in, and it's not enough time to get out to everyone because we have our own work schedules and different things like that too. But remember that it's a continuous process and not just a one-time shot.
Just to clarify, are you suggesting even that we remind grantees in upcoming e-newsletters that they can invite allocation committee members on site visits and things like that? Because I think that's an easy thing to deliver on, and I just want to clarify that's yeah, okay.
Yeah, and you're all on the website, your emails are, and every recap that I send out, I have a link. I put it right in the newsletter saying you're welcome to contact allocation committee members. I have a link on the website. All your emails and your contact information is out there. And I do forward things to some of you about, when I go out to events, and I'm always telling grantees to contact. I do get a lot of calls, and I send it on to you. And some of the grantees are better than others. I think some of them are a little hesitant. They don't want to bug you, but I always encourage them to do that. So we'll keep doing that, and we'll do that more.
It also occurs to me that if we took the suggestion that you all kind of, or whoever said, about you taking an area to be responsible for, that maybe it would make sense to be doing that now. And then that way you wouldn't necessarily be trying to see programs in every funding area, but you would have an area where you were trying to get to know the grantees. At least, the grantees is only one portion of who applies. So I'm not trying to suggest that would take care of everything, but at least you would have a sense for who is currently being funded, and to the extent you're unfamiliar with them or don't really know that much about them, you would have a chance to educate yourself about that. Go out for a site visit, because we will site visit everybody usually, and we do it in year 2. So, you have opportunities to join us, or if you don't want to just do it on your own, it's fine. Or just even have a meeting, just even have a coffee with the program person so that you have a chance to just talk to them about what they're doing, and they can tell you some good stories about what's happening, and that kind of thing. I think that people would actually probably really appreciate that. So then when it comes time for applications, then you've at least got done some of the work. Now you can focus on the ones that you don't know, who are applying that are new, right?
And I say that because, during the funding, during that period, you can get 100 emails and I started answering some of them, then it just got to be overwhelming and I wasn't able to get to all of them. And I was able to get out to some places, but it would be nice for it to let them know that it just doesn't stop there. But it's even if you didn't get funded, or if you're thinking about it later, if you want us to know more about your program, invite us out, you know what I'm saying? So.
I think that in terms of whether we go the liaison route and who would handle which areas, I think that's something that I can poll the members on between now and whenever we have our next meeting, and maybe come forward with a recommendation. at our next meeting.
And we can help facilitate things happening between you and the folks in your area, so we can assist in that. And that would be good, because you'd have some time, and then you look at renewals. I mean, renewals come up before you know it, so then you'd have a chance. That would be good background for that. You know, it would help you there.
I just want to go back to actually number 3 on this list that was provided, which is a great reminder to us, I think, is what are we hoping to accomplish by allowing more time? What should our goals be? In other words, even though I think from the feedback you got is that everyone's saying we need more time, but what's the goal? What would more time? What's the outcome that we want? So that we're not just stretching something out because people thought it sounded like a good idea. I mean, we really, this is an effort in which we're, all these metrics, and we're really wanting outcomes in terms of our children and the expectations that the taxpayers of Portland have on us, and all of that. And so, I hope I would want to, I guess, be sure that we're answering that, somehow can identify what our goal is if we're going to add more time. And I'm not sure, I can't articulate that, and maybe someone on staff can.
I don't feel like I have an answer to that, but I do feel like it is the question we need to ask for the reasons you're raising, Julie. And in part, I think that the pure limitations of the resources we have available and the demand that we just fielded, and from the outset, how much likely disappointment we're setting up is a very difficult dynamic in this process, and it doesn't feel like the right one to be having. And I feel like there has to be a way that we can think about how to structure things differently so that we're not creating from the beginning such a large margin of likely disappointment, especially for the amount of work that people put into it. And I guess I think that that's part of the time question. Like, more time without trying to figure out how to maybe basically, I think, reduce in some ways the applicant pool so that the likely disappointments can't be as great. Doesn't seem, I mean, more time for equal amounts of disappointment doesn't seem like the right way to go. And so, I mean, I would want us to think about how to use more time to get to the best product, and having done some thinking on the front end about how to better filter things in a way that doesn't have so much demand being created, knowing we have such limited supply of resources.
Yeah, if said a different way, I completely agree with Julie. I think what she's saying is it's not just a quantity, it's a quality issue. And I don't think that if we double the amount of time we spend and don't change the structure, we're going to see any difference in terms of outcomes and reviews. I really think Julie is absolutely right that we got to filter it with a quality and then decide how much time we need after we do that. Once we decide what sounds like a better system, then we can decide how much time we need to spend.
I think that one of our goals in this process was that we thought that by having goals and strategies, we would limit the number of applicants somewhat, because people would say that what I do does not fit with this. And what we found is that that didn't really work. So I think that, we keep trying to get to that, and we keep mostly not succeeding. So I think there would have to be, I think it would require a two-step kind of some kind. I'm not saying what the two steps would be, because I don't know if I know, but something where the pool is, and that in itself, one of the reasons we haven't done that is because that takes more time. Two steps take more time. You have to separate them. You have to figure out how you're going to review the two steps, right? So, one step has to be reviewed, and then the second step has got to be reviewed. I mean, and then if you want time to be interfacing with people face to face, and maybe in groups of two or something like that, that you could do, not at a giant meeting, but where you could ask questions, that would take more time. So, I mean, you're right, that the design, the timing has to follow the design. It's hard to imagine a two-step design that would take less time. I can't see it. I mean, I think we have been struggling always to try to compress this into a year's worth of work, and it's getting harder and harder to do as we add more data and other things on to your, evaluations of it. So I think you're right, absolutely. We got to design and then think time, but we have to imagine how much time that design is likely to take to execute before we actually do it, I think. Would be.
And just one other thing, sorry to keep jumping in, but we did hear a lot, I think fiscal year end, June 30, or school year end, or however, there are so many programs are on that it's really a hardship if we can't respect that so they can do their planning. And I know that'll bump up against more time too. So that's another practical issue.
Finishing the process.
And I want to say thank you all, because like Mitch said earlier, even with everything that's going on and all the feedback that's coming back, you all really did an excellent job in giving us a lot of detailed information, even on the thumb drive, and killed a lot of trees. But I just want you to know that I really appreciate the information that you gave to us and all the information that we did receive. It's just a lot. And this was my first year. And so I want to take that as a learning year as well. And it was a lot to learn in a really quick time. But I thank you for the assistance that you did provide, and the information that was given to us. So it was great.
I wanted to make just one other comment about the process that we've gone through, and the feedback, and that these are really difficult decisions. And if it were based only on metrics, we could put all of that information in a machine and it would come out with the decisions. But that isn't how you work in social services. You're dealing with families and children and communities, and you're dealing with this part of it that has, this is the human element, and we're all the same way, and we won't get to a perfect system. If we wanted to do that, we really would go the machine route, and we're not going to do that. So, I hope we definitely, there's room for improvement, and I think there's room for creativity in how we get there. And in terms of more time, I guess right now we need a little more time to work with staff to figure out what that looks like, so that we can serve the children and the organizations better.
Well, I did want to ask Liz Curry-Smith of Chair Kafori's office if you had anything you wanted to share with us. We're sort of getting towards the end. You need to come up to a microphone, though, if you do.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'm Liz Smith-Curry from Chair Kafori's office. It's okay, everybody gets that backwards. No, but I think Chair Kafori would echo a lot of the comments that were made here today, and appreciate the staff for the hard work. And I know that as a staffer to her, I appreciate the information that has come down so clearly from your office. So thank you.
Okay, so I think we're pretty much at the end here.
I would just say what we'll do is we'll kind of try to take what we've discussed today and try to come back and begin to put a little bit more flesh on the bone, so we get to what we're aiming toward is just sort of some recommendations that are a little bit more defined for. I mean, some of us may or may not be here the next time the RFI process. I don't mean that in terms of death, but people may move on. And well, I just realized that the way I phrased that was not maybe the best. Okay, never mind. bottom line is that because we don't know what will happen down the line, it'd probably be good to put something on paper and have your recommendations come together in a bit more formal manner. I don't know, maybe I got death on the brain. I don't know. What can I say?
But you can turn your mic. I just want to thank, again, echo what Serena said, thank the staff for all their hard work that they've done throughout everything. And while we don't have another allocation committee meeting scheduled at this time, we will be meeting soon to come up with a process to invest the $8.1 million we have available to us over the next 3 years that we did not anticipate before. And maybe look at some of the issues around liaison assignments and other things like that. So we, in the meantime, people can certainly follow what's going on at childrenslevy.org and I think, and Facebook, yes, and Facebook. And with that, we stand adjourned. Thank you.